Cinderella goes out into the world. If someone had told you that the hardest day for a queen could be the day she decided to go alone to the market, you probably wouldn't have believed them. Queens were used to halls, servants, schedules, and quiet steps behind them. But this was not an ordinary day. This was the day Cinderella chose. Morning in the palace began as it always did. Windows were opened wide, letting in fresh air. Footsteps echoed along the corridors. Voices called names, doors opened and closed, and everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. Everyone except Cinderella. She was not standing in front of a mirror with a crown in her hands. She was sitting on a small bench, bending forward, tying her shoes carefully, like someone who planned to walk for a long time. The prince stood in the doorway, watching her. He tried to look calm, but his eyebrows gave him away. "Are you really going out alone?" he asked. "Just to the market," Cinderella replied, giving the lace a small pull and checking the knot. "And then I'll come back." "You know they won't leave you alone," he said. "After all, you're the queen." "I know," she smiled. "That's why I'm going early." She stood up and reached for the basket on the table. It was empty, light, and completely ordinary. The kind of basket people carried every day. That was exactly why she liked it. "If it gets chilly, take a cloak," the prince added. "I will," Cinderella said, draping it over her shoulders. "But if I get warm, I'll take it off. I'm not made of sugar." He laughed, though the worry didn't leave his face completely. When Cinderella stepped outside the palace gates, she paused for a moment, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted to take it all in. The street was already awake. People walked with baskets and sacks. Children ran back and forth, laughing and shouting. Somewhere farther away, two voices argued loudly about the price of something that clearly cost exactly as much as the seller wanted. Cinderella took a deep breath and started walking. Very soon, the sounds of the city wrapped around her. It wasn't like the palace halls where every word echoed and footsteps were measured. Here, words bumped into each other, interrupted, laughed, and continued without waiting. She liked that. The market was already full. Stalls stood close together, almost touching. People stopped, touched vegetables, smelled bread, shook their heads, talked, and touched again. Everything moved at once, but somehow it all worked. Cinderella walked slowly. Not because she was afraid of getting lost, but because if she walked faster, she would miss too much. She stopped at the first stall she came to, not because she planned to buy anything yet, but because the woman selling apples smiled at her as if they had known each other for years. "Good morning," the woman said. "Fresh apples, just brought in." Cinderella picked one up, turned it in her hand, and tapped it lightly with her finger. "I like this one," she said. "I'll take 3. "3?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "That's a good start." Cinderella laughed and placed the apples into her basket. It was still light, but she already felt that it wouldn't stay that way for long. A little farther on, a man was selling fabrics. Long pieces of cloth hung from his stall and moved gently whenever someone passed by. "This one is strong," he said, pointing. "Good for work. Makes a fine apron." Cinderella leaned closer. "An apron is exactly what I'm looking for," she said. The man looked her up and down, then smiled. "Then you're in the right place." She chose a piece, folded it carefully, and placed it in the basket. The basket was already heavier now, and she switched it to her other hand. As she walked on, she noticed a small commotion. A child had dropped an orange. It rolled across the ground and stopped right at Cinderella's feet. "Oh no," the child cried. Cinderella bent down, picked up the orange, and handed it back. "Hold it tight this time," she said. "Thank you." The child grinned and ran back to his mother. Cinderella continued walking. She noticed that people were no longer staring at her as closely. They still noticed her, but now she felt like part of the movement, not something standing apart. At the egg stall, the seller was counting out loud. 8, 9. "Could I have 6? Cinderella asked. "You can," he said, placing them carefully into a small box. "Careful, eggs break." "I know," she replied. "That's why I'll put them on top." A little farther on, someone was playing a flute. The sound floated above the noise of the market. People stopped for a moment, listened, then moved on. Cinderella stayed a little longer. The music reminded her of balls and polished floors. But here, no one danced formally. Some people just nodded their heads or tapped their feet. When her basket became heavy, Cinderella sat on the stone edge of a fountain and washed her hands. An older woman sat beside her. The The market is tiring, the woman said. Yes, Cinderella agreed. But if you don't sit down, you don't really feel it. The woman looked at her, surprised, then laughed. You speak wisely. Cinderella stood again, bought a small bouquet of flowers, and placed it carefully on top of the basket. For whom? The seller asked. She thought for a moment. For home, Cinderella answered. And with that, she continued walking, already knowing this day would not end the way it began. Cinderella continued walking through the market, her basket resting against her hip. It was heavier now, and she felt it with every step, but she didn't mind. The weight felt real, like proof that the morning was truly happening. The market slowly changed as the sun climbed higher. The early rush faded. Some stalls grew quieter, others busier. Voices overlapped, then separated again. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed loudly, and a cart rattled past. Cinderella stopped near a bread stall. The smell was warm and comforting. Loaves lay in neat rows, some round, some long, their crusts golden and cracked. Fresh bread, the baker said, still warm. Cinderella touched one carefully. It smells like morning, she said. The baker smiled. That's the best kind. She bought a loaf and placed it gently into her basket, rearranging the eggs so they wouldn't move. As she turned away, she heard raised voices. Two people stood near a stall of vegetables. One pointed at a pile of carrots, the other shook their head. That's too much, one said. Cinderella slowed her steps. She didn't step closer, but she listened. The voices grew sharper, then suddenly quieter. It's fine, one of them said at last. Just give me half. They nodded and began to count. Cinderella walked on. She noticed how often people stopped, not only to buy, but to talk. A few words here, a short laugh there. The market wasn't only about things. It was about moments. Near a corner, she heard someone calling. Excuse me. Cinderella turned. An elderly man stood behind her, holding a small sack. I think you dropped this, he said. She looked down. A piece of fabric had slipped from her basket. Oh, she said. Thank you. She took it and tucked it more securely inside. You're welcome, the man said, then paused. You walk like someone who's learning the city. Cinderella smiled. I am. That's a good way to walk, he nodded and continued on his way. As Cinderella moved farther from the center of the market, the streets narrowed. The noise softened. Shops became smaller, quieter. Here, people spoke in lower voices and doors stayed half open. She stopped at a small stall selling wooden spoons and bowls. A woman behind the table looked up. Looking for something? She asked. Not sure yet, Cinderella answered honestly. The woman nodded. That's how you usually find the best things. Cinderella picked up a wooden spoon. It was smooth, worn from use. This one's been used a lot, she said. Yes, the woman replied. It knows what it's for. Cinderella liked that. She bought the spoon and placed it in her basket, careful not to knock the eggs. As she walked on, she noticed the sky changing. Clouds drifted in, soft and gray. A light breeze moved through the street. She adjusted her cloak. Good thing I brought you, she murmured. Suddenly, she heard a small cry. She turned and saw a little girl standing alone near a stall. Her eyes were wide and her hands clutched a torn ribbon. I can't find my mother, the girl said. Cinderella knelt down. Where did you see her last? She asked. The girl pointed. Near the apples. Cinderella stood and looked around. The crowd had shifted. Let's walk together, she said, slowly. They moved back toward the apple stall. Cinderella held the girl's hand lightly, not pulling, just guiding. There, the girl said suddenly. A woman turned, her face full of worry. There you are, she cried, pulling the girl close. Thank you, she said to Cinderella. Cinderella nodded. She was brave. The woman smiled. So were you. Cinderella stepped away, her heart beating a little faster. Not from fear, but from something like relief. The market felt different now, not louder or quieter, just closer. Her basket was full. Not overflowing, but complete. She decided it was time to head back. On the way, she passed the flute player again. This time, he smiled at her and played a softer tune. Cinderella paused, listening. She didn't think of the palace. She didn't think of titles. She thought of the day, how it moved, how it changed, how it asked her to notice. When she reached the palace gate, the guards straightened. You're back already? One asked. Yes, Cinderella said, and right on time. She stepped inside, the stone floor cooled beneath her shoes. The noise of the market faded behind her, replaced by the softer sounds of the palace. In the kitchen, she set her basket down. The cook looked inside and raised an eyebrow. You've been busy. Cinderella smiled. The market was too. She began unpacking apples, bread, eggs, fabric, flowers. And this? The cook asked, lifting the wooden spoon. Cinderella shrugged. It knew what it was for. The cook laughed. That afternoon, Cinderella sat for a moment by the window, her hands resting in her lap. She felt tired, but not the kind that makes you want to stop, the kind that tells you something mattered. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, Cinderella felt steady. And the day was not finished yet. The afternoon light softened as Cinderella stood by the kitchen window. The market sounds still echoed gently in her ears, voices, footsteps, laughter, but now they felt far away, like a story she had just finished reading. She took a deep breath and tied the apron she had cut from the fabric she bought earlier. It wasn't perfect. The edges weren't straight, and one stitch was a little loose. She smiled. That's all right, she said quietly. It will hold. The cook watched her work. You didn't have to do this yourself, she said. I wanted to, Cinderella replied. I like knowing how things are made. The cook nodded and returned to stirring the pot. Cinderella began helping, washing apples, placing eggs carefully on a shelf, slicing bread slowly so it wouldn't crumble. She worked calmly without hurry. The palace felt different now. Not quieter, just more open. Later, she carried a small tray into the garden. The flowers from the market stood in a vase, their colors bright but gentle. She placed the tray on a table near the fountain and sat down. The prince joined her after a while. You were gone longer than I expected, he said. So was the day, Cinderella answered. He looked at the apron, the basket now empty at her feet, her slightly tired eyes. And? He asked. She thought for a moment. It wasn't easy, she said, but it was good. He smiled. That sounds like you. They sat together, listening to the water move softly in the fountain. A servant passed by and stopped. Everything all right, Your Majesty? He asked. Cinderella looked up and nodded. Yes, she said. Very. The servant smiled and continued on his way. As evening came, the palace lights were lit one by one. Cinderella walked through the halls, noticing how the shadows stretched and softened. She stopped in front of a mirror, not to look at her crown, but at her hands. They were a little red from work, a bit tired, very real. That night, dinner was simple. Soup, bread, apples for dessert. Cinderella sat at the table, not at the head, but among the others. The prince noticed. You don't have to, he said quietly. I know, she answered, but I want to. After dinner, she returned to her room. She placed the apron neatly over a chair. The basket rested by the door. She opened the window. The city below was calm now. Fewer voices, slower steps, lights glowing softly. She leaned on the sill. Today felt long, she said to the night. In a good way. There was a soft knock. The prince stood in the doorway. Do you regret it? He asked. She shook her head. No, she said. I learned something. What? He asked. That being queen doesn't mean staying inside, she replied, and being outside doesn't mean forgetting who you are. He considered that. Will you go again? He asked. Yes, Cinderella said, but maybe not tomorrow. He smiled. Fair enough. When he left, Cinderella sat on the bed and removed her shoes slowly. Her feet were tired but steady. She lay down, pulling the blanket up to her shoulders. As sleep came closer, she thought about the apple seller's smile, the lost child's hand in hers, the sound of the flute, the weight of the basket. The world outside the palace had not changed. But she had... In the morning, she would wake again. There would be windows to open, halls to walk through, choices to make. And somewhere beyond the walls, a market would be waiting, busy, noisy, alive. But tonight, Cinderella closed her eyes. The palace rested. And so did she.